game number 1 against John Leben. We start things off with e4, c6, knight f3, d5. I pretty much always start off with these two pawn moves as black, unless if white starts with d4, then I have something else in my mind. I usually play the Queen's Gambit declined, but almost against everything else, I go with c6 and d5. Here we have e5, I play c5, trying to gain some control over that center, and here we have c3, probably preparing this move or that move with one of those pawns. I play bishop g4, pinning the knight to the queen. The queen gives a little bit of a check, attacking the king, as well as the bishop. So if I make a nothing move, like blocking the check this way or that way, the queen will just gobble up my bishop. The other move I considered was queen d7 to protect the bishop, but I did not want the queen to take, and then either my king or knight or bishop would take. In other words, I didn't want to trade queens. I wanted to keep pieces on the board because I wanted things to be complicated, because I needed to win all of my games. So I brought the bishop back to keep the queens on the board. And now the queen went back to the starting square, and now I'm up a tempo. Now I have this bishop moved in. Ideally, I would like this bishop out either on this square or this square, because I eventually want to close things off with pawn to e6 so that the bishop is outside of this pawn chain while I do that. So it's not really being up a tempo, but it's still nice for me because it does kind of feel like I'm up a tempo here. I play knight c6, bishop e2, he's getting ready to castle. I go back to bishop g4. Now there's no more check because my knight is here in the way. He plays the move d4, e6, and I successfully close off these pawns with the bishop outside of that pawn chain. Here we have a3, probably preparing to try to open things up with b4. Here I play queen b6, eyeing down on more pressure on this pawn. I'm threatening to chop off that defender of that pawn and then win it. I'm also eyeing some pressure down on the pawn on b2. So if this bishop were to ever move away, this pawn is loose. Here we have the move b4. And I go with my plan. I remove the defender and then I grab the pawn. So pretty much right out of the opening, I am up a pawn and pretty happy with this. So he castles and I grab another pawn. I take this one. Now we have queen takes d4. And this is a pretty serious mistake because it allows me to do a series of captures that seriously damages white's pawn structure. We start things off with knight takes bishop check, attacking the king and the queen at the same time. So the only way to avoid a queen loss is to capture the knight this way with the pawn, and that's what he did. Now I capture the queen, and he takes back this way. Now for a moment, take a look at the pawn structure here. Let's look at my side. I have one pawn island, and I have two pawn islands here. White, on the other hand, has one pawn island, two pawn islands, 3, and 4. And the king side is opened here, doubled pawns over here. It's very clear to see who has the better pawn structure, and it's me. I have the better pieces as well. I'm going to quickly route my knight over here. I'm going to develop my bishop. I might castle. I might bring my king out here. I'm in much better shape than white is. So I made those trades to damage that pawn structure to get me this easy road to victory. So I do play knight e7, knight c3, also developing his knight. Now I have knight f5, putting some pressure over here. I can't fall asleep. If I do absolutely nothing, white will play this and that and then win my rook, because that would be a fork. He does play knight b5, but I just play king d7, blocking that square, because I would just simply take it with my king. Bishop e3, probably trying to see if I'm willing to take it, but I don't take that bishop because that will only help his pawn structure get more better. I don't want to take. I want to keep that bishop there, babysitting that pawn. Instead, I continue with my plan. I first kick out this knight. The knight goes back, and then I put a rook on c8 on this nice open file. Ideally, I would like to get this bishop out of the way and double up. Maybe go here and then go there. And that is pretty much what I did. The rook goes over there. Develop my bishop. We have f4. And I play rook c4. Now I'm very close to doubling up. I'm also threatening to take this pawn because it's now protected also by that rook. The knight goes there to defend that pawn, but this just allows me to trade, and I'm more than happy to swap off all the rooks, because if we look at what's left now, I have an extremely dominant pawn structure, and white does not, and that's what will help me win. My king is also a lot more active than white's king. I am a lot closer to this pawn and this pawn than white is to any of mine. So we have knight c3, king c7, king f1. The king is trying to get into the game, but it's a little bit too late at that point. King b6, king e2, and now I play a5, trying to disrupt this pawn chain over here. I have this bishop looking at both of them, so if one of these pawns ever moves, I take the other with my bishop, and I'm pretty happy. So here we have pawn takes, king takes, a4, which I think is a pretty serious mistake because of bishop b4, threatening to remove the defender of that pawn. The knight moves, and I grab that pawn. We have knight c7, bishop d6, and the knight is trapped. The knight here has nowhere to go. This bishop is guarding this square and this square. The pawn is guarding that square, and the knight is guarding this. So this knight is stuck, it's dead, it's buried. Now what I'm going to do is take my other piece, the king, and slowly march. 1, 2, 3, in 4 moves. I'm going to gobble up that knight, and there is absolutely nothing that white can do to stop it. King d3, king b5. Bishop d2, king c6, king c3, king d7. Now my king is ready to take that knight on the next move. White does the most logical thing and takes a pawn, because if that knight's going down, may as well take a pawn. I take back, and at this point it is pretty much all over. King b4, knight h5, putting a little bit of pressure on that pawn. So the pawn moves. I don't want to take it and let the king come here and hurt my pawn structure, so I just ignore that pawn for now and scoop up that pawn with my bishop. I take back with the pawn, maintaining this little pawn chain over here. King c5, bishop g1. My plan here is to get some clearance. I want to get both these pieces off of that file and then march this one forward. So there. I bring knight g3 in. The king moves. I don't really care about this pawn. I will let him gobble it up. I'm more interested about this pawn. So I take that pawn with check. The king takes here. h5. Here we go. The pawn of the game. Bishop e1. Trying to stop my pawn from going, but it's going. You can't stop the train. You can't stop the chain. This is what's going to happen. I'm just going to roll the pawn all the way up the board, pretty much. King a6. I guess it's a waiting move. But I'm going to play bishop f6 now and add a defender to that pawn. Now I'm free to move the knight out of the way and then move the pawn up. He makes one more move. I play knight e4, and here in this position, white resigns. And the reason is because if white does not capture this pawn right now and loses the bishop, let's just say white makes another waiting move with the king. Now there's no way for him to stop it because my knight controls this square and this square. There is no way for white to stop my pawn. This knight is just absolutely dominating this bishop. That is game number 1. Let's dive into game number 2. This time I had the white pieces against an unrated player named Slohan Bezera. Slohan is unrated, but he had just beat a 1650. So I knew that this guy was probably very good. He could have been a 2000 level strength. I don't know. I just knew I had to play my best and try to win. So we start things off with e4, e6, d4, d5. This is the French defense, and we go into an exchange variation. knight f3, and bishop d6. Here we have c4, c6, knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5, pinning that knight to the queen. Here we have knight bd7, and I take. I'm just straight up winning a pawn out of the opening. This knight here can never move because the queen would be taken. So that is a free pawn. So takes and takes. I'm up a pawn right out of the opening. I'm extremely happy about this. Castles, bishop e2, queen a5 check. Yeah, it looks a little bit scary, but all I need to do is move my knight back. This knight is doing a great job at protecting that bishop. Knight e4, putting a little bit of pressure over here, putting pressure here, and also over there. But I just moved my bishop. Takes, takes. Knight f6, I castle. And at this point, I'm pretty happy. I'm up a pawn, but I'm not like totally winning per se, but I am up a pawn, and I'm pretty happy about that. Rook e8. Here, I try to provoke something that actually happened. I play bishop b5 with the hopes that he would move the rook down because I have something cooked up my sleeve. In hindsight, he probably could have played this move, bishop d7, but anyway, he played rook e7, and now I play bishop c4 with a dirty trick in mind. My idea is to play knight d5, hitting the queen and also hitting the rook. And he pretty much allows me to do it. He plays bishop g4, threatening, of course, to take and hurt my pawn structure, but that completely loses to knight d5. Now, the reason I moved my bishop, I wanted to play it knight d5 first, but if I played it, the queen would take my bishop, I would take the rook, and he would take back. So if you think about it, I would lose the knight and the bishop for one rook. So that's 6 for 5, and I didn't want to do that, so I wanted to keep my bishop first. That's why I moved it. And now this works. Okay? The queen could take mine, but I have this in-between move, check, before I take back, winning me that rook. Queen goes here to defend the rook, but I take it, and now I'm up the exchange, and I'm super happy. I play rook e1, hitting the queen goes there. Rook c1, probably a little bit inaccurate, but I did like to keep this pressure on the queen, always threatening some sort of discovery with my bishop. But yeah, he makes the correct move, taking my knight, and with check. But I'm completely fine here. I'm up the exchange. Queen d6, rook c2, because I do want to get my rook over here. So like, I'm going to move my queen down, move my rook over, and then try to barrel down and just try to checkmate black. Bishop f4, queen d1, getting ready to double up on that e-file with my rooks. We have rook d8, but yeah, he is attacking the pawn twice, but I can simply play rook e2, and I do. If the queen tries to take the pawn, I will more than happily capture that, because if he takes back, boom, knight takes, this would be checkmate. So obviously, black does not take that pawn, because otherwise he would lose a queen straight up, and if he retakes, just as I showed, it would be checkmate. So instead, he makes this move h6, trying to give the king an escape, and thus keeping that threat alive. I play the move rook e7. Now I have pressure going here. So if he does take, I can try to attack that pawn somehow. So we have knight d5. And now I'm thinking it's time to trade the rooks and attack the king, starting off with rook e8 check. The rook doesn't take my rook, instead the king goes down here. But I have this check, and now it's showtime. Pawn plays g6, rook takes d8, queen takes d8, queen e4. A quiet move, just one square, but it's a multi-purpose move. One, it does add an attacker to that knight that's only being defended by the queen. If that knight ever moves, this bishop is loose. I'm also thinking about having more control over this e-file now. Maybe I'll someday play queen e8, bring my rook in, and just checkmate the enemy king. And that is pretty much what I end up doing in just a couple of moves. So here we have queen g5 check, but this is just a meaningless check because I go here, move right out of the way. King f1. Knight b6, trying to attack my bishop, but I can just ignore it. Queen e8. If he does take my bishop, yes, I do have a fork, but I'm not even thinking about the fork. This would have been checkmate. So, he doesn't take my bishop. Instead, he plays queen f5 to protect that pawn. I play rook e7, adding yet another attacker to that pawn. Black is running out of resources to defend that pawn. He throws in another check, and this pretty much seals the deal. After king g2, black has no more checks, and he is in trouble. He moves the pawn to h5, but this, in a last-ditch effort to give the king some sort of escape, but I take the pawn with my queen, and it is lights out. 1, it's a fork, and 2, he is simply just getting checkmated. So, 1, if he goes to the corner, this is checkmate, and 2, if he comes down here, this is check. There's only one move, this pawn move, and then I would play queen here. The only move is to block, and then I would play this check, and then the only move is to block here, and then I would take the queen for checkmate. So, black saw all of this stuff, so he had resigned after I had played this queen takes f7 check move. And that is game 2. There's just one game left, and this last game was against my good friend Joel Martin. He was in my high school chess club. We've played so many games together. He's beaten me many times. I've beaten him many times. We have a nice friendly rivalry going on. So we both had 2 wins, and this was a critical matchup for both of us. So he had the better tiebreaks, meaning that if he draws our game, he is most likely going to be the champion. So I'm in a position where I have the white pieces, and it's a must-win position for me. I must win this game to win the championship. And I do. I beat him. And I study the opening he plays, and this way I was able to come out with somewhat of an advantage. I beat him pretty fast. Let's see how it went down. We have e4, c5, knight f3, e6, c3, knight f6. This is a delayed a la pin. I play e5, knight d5, and g3. This is the move I've been studying. I don't want to get too much in the details of the opening because we are in another ongoing tournament, and I'm likely to face Joel again there. We might be playing the same opening, so I don't want him watching this video and get some opening ideas. So I'm just going to tell you what happened. So we have b6, bishop g2, bishop b7, castles, d6, and I take that pawn, bishop takes, and then d4. Here we have knight f6. To me, this seems like a bit of a concession. It's moving away from the center, so I am pretty happy about that. I keep on developing with knight bd2. Takes, I take back with the knight. Bishop takes mine, and I take back here. We have bishop e5, which, I mean, yeah, it's attacking the knight here 2 ways. But I just move it and put more pressure here on the bishop, so I feel like I'm kind of winning a tempo here. We have queen d5, and now I play queen c2. Under no circumstances I wanted to trade pieces with Joel. Joel is very good at endgames, and I knew this going in, that I refused to trade pieces. I really did not want to trade pieces unless I absolutely had to. And I wanted to avoid queen trades at all costs. So I wanted my queen away from the same direction as his queen. So I played queen c2, knight c6, and rook d1. And here black decides to queenside castle. And I actually invoke him to make a serious blunder. I make this move queen a4 with the idea that he might try for this. And that is exactly what happened. He plays knight e4, and that move cost him the game. Now, at a first glance, it looks like knight e4 is a really good move. It's attacking the knight, Yes, it's currently defended by 2 pieces, but it's also being attacked by 3 pieces. So it is something to consider. He can always go here and pile up and put way more pressure on this. If this knight were to ever move, the queen would take, and it's protected by the rook, and I would lose a rook. Now I don't care, because this straight up loses the knight. I take it. If you want to take my rook, fine. You're just dead lost if you do. And he fell right into it. He took that rook. If I, of course, take the queen and rook takes, then that would be really silly. So I don't do that. Instead, I take the knight with check. He plays this move, bishop c7, and it's all over after bishop f4. Exposing my other rook to the queen. I'm willing to sacrifice both of my rooks to get a checkmate, because if the queen takes my rook like this, boom, lights out. It's protected by that bishop. So he doesn't take my rook. Instead, he plays rook d6, but this is just all over. Knight takes, king moves, I gobble up the queen, and at this point, it's all over. And this is checkmate. And that is how I became the South Florida chess champion. Thanks so much for watching my video. I hoped you've learned a thing or two. I hoped these games were pretty entertaining. And I'll see you next time. Make sure to subscribe. Take care.